Korean billionaire CEO went to buy an engagement ring. Then he saw his ex-wife behind the counter with a little girl. Minho Park had closed billion-dollar deals without flinching. Yet standing inside Seoul's most exclusive jewelry boutique, the small velvet box in his hand suddenly felt heavier than any contract he'd ever signed. The showroom gleamed with quiet opulence, hand-polished glass cases, soft lighting that made even the smallest diamonds look like stars. A place where wealth whispered instead of shouted. He'd chosen this boutique precisely because it was discreet. No one would recognize the CEO whose face appeared on business magazines and financial news. Tonight was meant to be simple. Select the perfect ring, finalize his future, leave with everything neatly contained in a signature blue box. A transaction like any other. But when Minho raised his eyes from the display case, the world beneath him shifted. Behind the counter stood a woman he had buried under years of acquisitions, expansions, and carefully constructed success. Jeon Kim, the only person who had ever seen him before he became someone worth seeing. Her hair was shorter now, falling just above her shoulders instead of the long waves she once wore. She dressed differently, a simple black dress beneath a tailored blazer. Professional, contained. Nothing like the art student with paint-stained fingers who used to laugh at his too serious expressions. And beside her, half hidden behind the counter, stood a little girl. Small fingers clutching a sketchbook. Dark eyes that watched him with curious caution. A child who couldn't be more than 7 or 8 years old. The air between them crystallized into something brittle and dangerous. Recognition dawned in Jeon's eyes, first surprise, then something harder to define. "Welcome to Luminous Designs," she said, her voice formal, practiced, the kind reserved for strangers. Then a flicker of acknowledgement crossed her face. Minho. He tried to respond, but his voice had abandoned him. The little girl tugged at Jeon's sleeve. "Yama," she whispered. "Who is that man?" Jeon's hand moved instinctively to the child's shoulder. "An old acquaintance," she answered. Old acquaintance. Not the woman who had once believed in him when his dreams were just sketches on napkins. Not the wife who had waited up while he worked through the night. Just an old acquaintance. As if 12 years could be compressed into something that casual. Minho crouched slightly, finding a smile that felt foreign on his face. "Hello there. I'm Minho. What's your name?" The girl pressed closer to her mother, half hiding behind her skirt. "Soo-min," she answered softly, clutching her sketchbook tighter. A name with weight, a name with history, a name that carried questions that lodged in his throat like broken glass. The diamonds in the case suddenly lost all meaning. The perfect cut, the flawless clarity, the promise of forever meant for someone who had never really known him at all. None of it mattered anymore, because standing behind that counter was the only woman who had ever asked him to choose love over ambition. And now, with a ring meant for someone else burning in his palm, Minho realized he had never truly made that choice. If you've ever wondered what happens when your past and future collide in one moment, this story might change how you see success forever. Hit subscribe now and join our community of storytellers. Comment below with where you're watching from. I read every comment and love connecting with you. Now, let's go back to where Minho's journey really began. 12 years earlier, Minho wasn't the kind of man who frequented exclusive boutiques. He was 26, ambitious beyond his means, with a startup that existed mainly in spreadsheets and pitch decks that had been rejected by 17 investors. His suit was off the rack, worn at the elbows from too many hours hunched over a laptop. That afternoon, Seoul had unleashed a monsoon rain that turned streets into rivers. Minho had ducked into a small tea house in Insadong, more to save his presentation materials than himself. The place was nearly empty. Just an old man reading a newspaper and a young woman with a sketchbook open before her. He chose a table near the window, spreading his damp papers out to dry. The rejection letter from that morning's investor meeting had bled ink across the page, turning their polite dismissal into something that looked like a Rorschach test. He was so fixated on salvaging what he could that he didn't notice the woman approach until she placed a steaming cup beside him. You look like you need this more than I do, she said, sliding the tea toward him. Ji-yeon wasn't conventionally beautiful in the way his mother would have approved. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek, hands stained with ink. But when she smiled, Min-ho forgot about the rain and the rejections and the fact that his bank account had dwindled to almost nothing. I can't take your tea, he protested. I didn't ask if you could, she replied, sitting across from him without invitation. I said you need it. He learned she was an art student with dreams of opening her own gallery. She showed him sketches that captured Seoul from angles he'd never considered, not the gleaming towers and neon signs, but the forgotten corners where life happened without permission. The elderly women selling vegetables from plastic buckets. Children playing in narrow alleys between apartment buildings. Places the economic miracle had left behind. Min-ho told her about his software platform designed to help small businesses compete against the conglomerates. He spoke too quickly, too intensely, the way he did when pitching to investors who checked their watches while he talked. But Ji-yeon didn't check the time. She asked questions no one else had bothered to ask. Not about profit margins or market penetration, but about the people his business would help. So you want to be a chaebol too? She asked, using the Korean term for the family-owned conglomerates that dominated the economy. No, he answered honestly. I want to build something that matters. Then you're already different, she said. They stayed until the tea house closed, then walked through streets still wet from rain, talking as if they'd known each other for years instead of hours. By the time he walked her home, Min-ho understood that success without someone to share it with was just another form of failure. Looking back now, Min-ho recognized how naive they had been. How easily they had believed that love could withstand the grinding demands of ambition. How foolishly they had trusted that intentions mattered more than choices. In the jewelry store, time condensed into a moment stretched too thin. Ji-yeon stood perfectly still, hands folded at her waist, eyes never leaving his face. Professional distance masking whatever storm might be brewing beneath. How can I help you today? She asked, her voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing. Min-ho glanced at the display case, then back at her. I didn't know you worked here. For 3 years now, she replied. I'm the lead designer. Of course she was. Ji-yeon had always created beauty from nothing. Soo-min peered up at him from behind her mother, dark eyes curious beneath a fringe of bangs that needed trimming. She clutched her sketchbook like armor, knuckles white against the spiral binding. Are you one of Iyama's friends? The girl asked suddenly. Friends. Such an inadequate word for what they had been to each other. We knew each other a long time ago, Min-ho answered, watching Ji-yeon's face for any reaction. She gave none. Before I was born? Soo-min continued, her innocence cutting through pretense. Ji-yeon placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. Soo-mina, why don't you sit at my desk and finish your drawing while I help this customer? Customer. Another inadequate word. Another careful erasure of what they had once been. The little girl nodded and retreated to a small desk behind the counter, opening her sketchbook to a half-finished drawing. Min-ho couldn't see what she was creating, but the intensity of her concentration mirrored her mother's so perfectly that his chest tightened. You're looking for an engagement ring? Ji-yeon asked, all business now. Min-ho nodded, unable to form words that wouldn't sound like betrayal. Congratulations, she said, the word perfectly empty. Do you have a particular style in mind? He wanted to ask about the child, about the years that had passed, about whether she ever thought of him when the city lights reflected on the Han River or when the cherry blossoms fell like snow in spring. Instead, he pointed at a platinum band with a solitary diamond. Simple, elegant, impersonal. Something like that, he said. Ji-yeon reached for the keys at her waist, unlocking the case with practiced efficiency. Nothing in her movements suggested this was anything but a routine transaction between strangers who had once shared everything. Their wedding had been small against his parents' wishes. They had wanted something grand, befitting the son of a middle-level executive at one of Seoul's largest corporations. His father had barely spoken to him for months after he announced his engagement to an art student with no family connections. "She will hold you back," his mother had warned. This is not how successful men build their futures. But Minho had been certain they were wrong. In their small apartment in Mapogu, with Ji-Yun's canvases stacked against the walls and his computer equipment crowding the dining table, he felt more alive than he ever had in his parents' perfectly appointed Gangnam apartment. They were happy in the way only people who don't know what's coming can be happy. Completely, foolishly, blindly. For 2 years, they built their dreams alongside each other. Ji-Yun took a job teaching art to children while trying to sell her paintings on weekends. Minho worked 18-hour days, refining his business plan, meeting anyone who might listen. Then came the breakthrough. A venture capital firm finally saw what 17 others had missed. The funding wasn't enormous, but it was enough to hire 3 employees and rent a small office space. Minho came home that night with a bottle of champagne they couldn't afford, lifting Ji-Yun into his arms and spinning her around their cramped kitchen. "This is just the beginning," he promised. "Everything changes now." He didn't realize how prophetic those words would become. Success, when it finally arrived, didn't come gradually. It crashed through their lives like a wave that had been building far offshore. Minho's platform caught the attention of small business owners, then industry publications, then larger investors. Suddenly, everyone wanted meetings. Everyone wanted partnerships. Everyone wanted a piece of what he had built. His days stretched longer. Breakfast meetings, lunch presentations, dinner negotiations, late-night calls with potential partners in different time zones. He started coming home after Ji-Yun was already asleep, leaving before she woke. Their conversations became briefer, focused on logistics rather than dreams. "Will you be home for dinner?" she would ask. "I'll try," he would answer, both of them knowing it wasn't really an answer at all. The Korean business world operated by its own rules. After-work gatherings were mandatory, not optional. Hierarchy was absolute. Sacrifice was expected. The chaebol culture he had once criticized began to shape him without his notice. He learned to drink with potential clients until the early hours, to show proper deference to older executives, to place business relationships above personal ones. Ji-Yun watched this transformation silently at first. She rearranged her schedule to match his unpredictable hours. She attended company functions where wives were expected to be decorative and undemanding. She stopped mentioning her own dreams of opening a gallery. He told himself it was temporary. Just until the next funding round. Just until they went public. Just until he could provide the life she deserved. Just until. Before we see what Minho decides next, I want to know what you would do in his place. Would you choose the life you've built or risk everything for a second chance? If this story is touching your heart, tap that like button right now so others can find it too. Now let's return to that moment in the jewelry store where everything is about to change. In the jewelry store, Minho watched as Ji-Yun placed 3 rings on a velvet tray before him. Her movements were elegant, practiced, revealing nothing of whatever emotions might be churning beneath her composed exterior. She had always been good at hiding pain, or too good, perhaps. It had made it too easy for him to pretend she was fine when she wasn't. "These are similar to the design you indicated," she explained, her voice professional. "The center one is our most popular for engagements." From the desk behind the counter, Soo-min had abandoned her drawing and was watching them with undisguised curiosity. Minho felt the weight of her gaze more acutely than any board meeting scrutiny. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the child. Ji-Yun hesitated, then nodded once, a tight movement that suggested permission granted against better judgment. Minho approached the desk carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment. Soo-min didn't retreat, but her fingers tightened around her pencil. "What are you drawing?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance. She considered him for a moment before turning her sketchbook toward him. The page showed a series of buildings, drawn with surprising skill for a child her age. Not the generic houses children usually create, but detailed structures with texture and dimension. It's the street where we live, she explained, pointing to various buildings. That's our apartment, and that's the flower shop, and that's where the cat always sits. The precision in her lines reminded him so much of Ji-yeon's work that it physically hurt to look at it. But there was something else there too, a mathematical precision to the proportions that felt oddly familiar. You're very talented, he said sincerely. Sumin's expression remained serious. Yama says talent doesn't matter without practice. Minho glanced at Ji-yeon, who was arranging something in a display case, her back deliberately turned to them. Your mother is very wise. Are you going to buy a ring for your girlfriend? Sumin asked with the direct curiosity only children can get away with. The question landed like a stone in still water. I was planning to. Iyama makes the best ones, she said with fierce loyalty. Everyone says so. Minho looked more closely at the rings on the velvet tray. Now that he was paying attention, he could see Ji-yeon's aesthetic in the designs, clean lines that somehow avoided being cold, subtle details that revealed themselves only on closer inspection. How old are you, Sumin? He asked, though he had already calculated the answer in his head. 7.5, she replied promptly. 7.5 years. 30 months after he and Ji-yeon had signed their divorce papers. A child conceived after their marriage had ended. A child who belonged to a life he had no part in. He should have felt relief. Instead, a different kind of loss took shape inside him, not the loss of something he had, but the loss of something he never knew to miss. The 3rd year of their marriage marked the beginning of the end, though neither of them recognized it at the time. Minho's company had expanded rapidly, opening offices in 3 cities. He traveled constantly, built a team of executives who shared his vision if not his values, secured partnerships that transformed his startup into a legitimate competitor to larger corporations. Ji-yeon had stopped teaching art classes. She claimed it was to focus on her own work, but her canvases remained untouched in the spare room of the larger apartment they'd moved into. When he asked about her paintings, she would change the subject. Your parents called, she said one night when he returned home past midnight. They want us to join them for your father's birthday next weekend. Minho loosened his tie, checking emails on his phone even as he responded. I can't. I have meetings in Tokyo. You could reschedule, she suggested. It's important to them. He looked up, irritated by the interruption to his workflow. It's important to me to close this deal. My father will understand. Like he understood when we missed Chuseok? Or your mother's surgery? The sharpness in her voice finally pulled his attention fully away from his phone. Ji-yeon stood in their kitchen, a space she had once filled with laughter and experimental recipes, looking like a stranger in her own home. What do you want from me? He asked, genuine confusion mixing with frustration. You know what I'm building. You know what's at stake. I know what you're losing while you build it, she answered quietly. He dismissed her concerns with promises he had no intention of keeping. One more quarter of growth. One more round of investment. One more milestone. Then he would slow down. Then they would take the vacation she wanted. Then they would start the family they had once planned. But the goalposts kept moving. Success bred expectations. Expectations bred pressure. Pressure bred absence. The promotion came on a Tuesday in spring. Minho was offered the chance to oversee international expansion, starting with Singapore, then Hong Kong, then beyond. It meant relocating for at least 2 years. It meant building the company's global presence from the ground up. He came home that night energized in a way he hadn't been for months, talking rapidly about opportunities and markets and potential. Ji-yeon listened silently, sitting at their dining table with hands folded neatly in her lap. When he finally paused for breath, she asked only one question. When do we leave? Minho stopped mid-sentence, confusion crossing his face. We? Ji-yeon, this isn't a family relocation. I'll be traveling constantly, working around the clock. You wouldn't see me any more than you do now. So I stay here, alone, for 2 more years. Her voice was flat, not a question but a confirmation of what she already knew. It's the opportunity of a lifetime, he insisted. This puts us in a different league entirely. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Us? There is no us anymore, Min-ho. There's your company, your success, your future. I'm just the wife who waits at home for a husband who stopped coming back years ago. That's not fair, he snapped. Everything I've done has been for our future. A future that never arrives. She stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending we're building something together when you're not even here. What are you saying? He demanded, though he already knew. I'm saying I want a divorce. The word hung between them, ugly and final. Min-ho had faced corporate raiders, hostile competitors, and ruthless investors without flinching. But in that moment, in his perfectly appointed apartment with the woman he had promised to love forever, he felt true fear for the first time. Not fear of losing. Hurt that had already happened in slow increments he had chosen not to notice. Fear of acknowledging that he had failed at the one thing that couldn't be measured in market share or revenue growth. You don't mean that, he said, reaching for her hand. She stepped back beyond his reach. I've been packing for weeks. You didn't even notice. And he hadn't. The missing books. The empty spaces on shelves where her small treasures had once stood. The closet that seemed somehow larger. All invisible to a man who had trained himself to see only what demanded immediate attention. Ji-yun, he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. Please don't make promises you won't keep, she said, voice breaking for the first time. We both deserve better than more lies. She left the next morning while he was in a breakfast meeting he refused to cancel. When he returned home that evening, half her belongings were gone. On the dining table lay a simple note. Asterisk, I hope you find what you're looking for. I need to find what I've lost. Asterisk. He signed the divorce papers without contest, told himself it was for the best, and boarded a plane to Singapore 3 weeks later. The apartment sold quickly. His clothes moved into hotel rooms, then corporate housing, then the penthouse he rarely saw in daylight. Success continued its relentless expansion. His company went public. His name appeared on lists of influential business leaders. His net worth accumulated more zeros than he had ever imagined possible. And none of it filled the silence that followed him from one empty space to another. In the jewelry store, Min-ho returned to the counter where the rings still waited on their velvet tray. Ji-yun stood with perfect posture, hands clasped before her, eyes revealing nothing. They're beautiful, he said, meaning it. You designed these? She nodded. Most of our signature collection. I always knew you would create something extraordinary, he said softly, the words escaping before he could censor them. A flicker of something crossed her face. Surprise, perhaps, or pain quickly mastered. Did you find what you were looking for? She asked, deliberately misinterpreting his comment to refer to the rings. No, he wanted to say, I've been looking in the wrong places. Instead, he pointed to the middle ring. May I see this one closer? She lifted it carefully, holding it out for his inspection without allowing their fingers to touch. The diamond caught the light, throwing fractured rainbows across the counter. It's flawless, he said. Nothing is flawless, Ji-yun replied, her first genuine response since he'd walked in. That's what makes it interesting. From her desk, Sumin watched them with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. Her sketchbook lay open, pencil abandoned mid-stroke. Min-ho felt the weight of her attention like a physical force. Your daughter, he began carefully. She has your talent. Ji-yun's eyes softened when she looked toward Sumin. She sees things differently. It makes life challenging sometimes. But her mind is remarkable. There was something in the way she said it, a protective pride mixed with worry, that triggered recognition in Min-ho. He looked at the child again, noting the intense focus, the methodical organization of her pencils, the way she had arranged her eraser and sharpener at precise angles to her paper. She's like me, he said quietly, the realization hitting him with unexpected force. Ji-yeon didn't confirm or deny it. She simply met his gaze steadily. She is exactly who she is meant to be. After he started. Yes, she interrupted, keeping her voice low enough that Soo-min couldn't hear. After. 1,000 questions crowded his throat, fighting to be asked first. Why didn't you tell me? How did this happen? Does she know about me? But the luxury store with its hushed atmosphere and hovering staff was no place for the conversation they needed to have. Ji-yeon, She shook her head once, decisively. Not here. Not now. He nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. This moment wasn't about them. It was about the child whose world could be upended by careless words. The ring, he said, refocusing on the pretext that had brought him here. I'll take it. Ji-yeon's expression remained carefully neutral as she reached for the jeweler's box. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, placing the ring in its satin nest, closing the lid with a soft snap. I'll prepare the paperwork, she said, turning toward the register. Min-ho stood motionless, watching her efficient movements, the way she had learned to navigate a world that had continued without him in it. He thought about the woman waiting for him at home, the sophisticated gallery owner whose social connections and flawless appearance complemented his corporate image perfectly. The woman for whom this ring was intended. A woman he had never once looked at the way he was looking at Ji-yeon now. Soo-min had abandoned her desk and now stood beside her mother, leaning against her hip in the casual way children claim their parents. Ji-yeon's hand came to rest on the girl's shoulder automatically, a gesture of reassurance so natural it clearly happened 1,000 times a day. Will your girlfriend like it? Soo-min asked, staring at the box. Min-ho looked at the child, this small person who carried parts of him she didn't even know about, and found he couldn't lie to her. I don't know, he answered honestly. Ji-yeon glanced at him sharply, surprise briefly breaking through her professional mask. Min-ho reached for his wallet, then stopped. The entire transaction suddenly felt wrong, hollow, performative, a continuation of choices made for appearance rather than truth. I need to think about this, he said abruptly. Ji-yeon paused, credit card terminal already in hand. Of course, we can hold it for 48 hours if you'd like. No, he said more decisively than he'd intended. I mean, thank you, but I need to reconsider more than just the ring. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by wariness. She had seen this version of him before, the one who made impulsive decisions based on emotions that wouldn't last. The one who promised what he couldn't deliver. As you wish, she said formally, returning the box to the display case. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Everything, he wanted to say. You can help me understand how we ended up here. You can help me know the daughter I didn't know I had. You can help me remember who I was before I forgot what mattered. Instead, he simply said, could I see you? Outside of here. The request hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Ji-yeon's expression remained carefully neutral, but he saw the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hand tightened protectively around Soo-min's. Why? She asked, direct as always. Because I'd like to know you again, he answered truthfully. Both of you. She studied him with the careful assessment of someone who had learned the hard way that intentions weren't enough. We're not an opportunity to be acquired, Min-ho. The word stung precisely because they exposed how he had approached everything in his life since their divorce, as assets to be evaluated and obtained. I know, he said quietly. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to talk. Ji-yeon glanced down at Soo-min, who was watching their exchange with undisguised interest. Whatever she saw in her daughter's face seemed to influence her decision. There's a park near our apartment, she said finally. Soo-min goes there after school most days when the weather is good. It wasn't an invitation exactly, more like a door left slightly ajar. Thank you, he said simply. She nodded once, a gesture so familiar it made his chest ache. Goodbye, Min-ho. He turned to leave, stopping briefly to address Soo-min. It was nice meeting you. Your drawings are wonderful. The girl smiled, a quick, bright expression that transformed her serious face. Goodbye, Minho SSI. The formal address from such a small person almost made him smile. Almost. As he walked out of the store, leaving the ring and all it represented behind, Minho felt lighter than he had in years. Not happy exactly, not unburdened, but as if he had finally set down something heavy he'd been carrying for so long, he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. The rain had cleared by the following Wednesday, when Minho found himself sitting on a bench in a neighborhood park he would never have visited in his normal life. Children played on modest equipment while mothers and grandmothers watched from nearby benches. Nothing impressive or exclusive, just a small green space carved out between apartment buildings. He had canceled 3 meetings to be there. His assistant had been shocked. In 7 years, he had never prioritized personal matters over business. His phone had buzzed constantly for the first hour until he finally turned it off completely, an act that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. When Ji-Yun appeared at the park entrance with Soo-min beside her, Minho's heart contracted painfully. They looked like they belonged to each other. The same careful way of moving, the same serious expression that occasionally broke into unexpected smiles. Soo-min spotted him first, tugging at her mother's hand and pointing. Ji-Yun nodded, saying something Minho couldn't hear, and the girl ran toward the playground while her mother approached his bench. "You came," she said, neither pleased nor displeased, simply acknowledging the fact. "I said I would," he replied. She sat beside him, leaving careful space between them. That didn't always mean much before. He accepted the observation without defense. "I know." They watched Soo-min join a group of children at the climbing structure, her movements more cautious than theirs, more deliberate. "She's mine, isn't she?" Minho asked quietly. Ji-Yun kept her eyes on the playground. "Biologically, yes. Why didn't you tell me?" Now she turned to look at him directly. "By the time I knew, you were in Singapore building your empire. The divorce was final. You had made your choices very clear. I had a right to know," he said, surprising himself with the hurt in his voice. "Yes," she agreed, unexpected in her honesty. "You did. I was angry and hurt and afraid. I made a decision I thought was best for her." "And now?" he asked. Ji-Yun sighed, a soft sound that carried years of carefully managed struggle. "Now I don't know. She has a good life. It hasn't been easy, but we're stable. She's happy. Without me," he added. "You can't miss what you never knew," she said gently. The truth of it cut deeper than accusation would have. Minho watched his daughter, this small, serious person with his analytical mind and Ji-Yun's artistic vision, and felt the full weight of everything he had sacrificed without realizing its value. "What have you told her about her father?" he asked. "That he lives far away. That sometimes grown-ups make difficult choices." Ji-Yun paused. "I never told her you didn't want her, if that's what you're asking." "I would have wanted her," he said fiercely. "If I'd known." Ji-Yun's expression softened slightly. "Would you have? Really? Would you have given up Singapore and Hong Kong and everything else you were building?" The question hung between them, impossible to answer honestly without admitting how much he had changed, or perhaps, how much he had remained the same person who had always put ambition first. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "But I'd like the chance to know her now." Ji-Yun watched Soo-min climbing higher on the structure, her small face intense with concentration. "It's not that simple. I know. She's not a project you can start and stop when it's convenient," she continued. "Children need consistency. They need people who show up even when it's difficult." The criticism was fair, but it still stung. "I'm not the same person I was." Ji-Yun gave him a look that saw through pretense. "Aren't you? You came to that jewelry store to buy a ring for another woman. Your life is still board meetings and business deals. What's really changed, Minho?" He had no ready answer, nothing that wouldn't sound like the same empty promises he'd made before. Instead, he asked, "What happened after I left?" Ji-Yun's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle stiffening of her shoulders. "Reality happened. I was pregnant, alone, and suddenly without the financial security I'd grown accustomed to. The settlement, he began, wasn't as generous as you thought, she finished. After lawyer fees, after taxes, after medical bills, it didn't last as long as I needed. Shame washed over him as he realized he'd never followed up, never checked whether the amount had been sufficient. He'd simply transferred the funds and considered his obligation fulfilled. I'm sorry, he said inadequately. I'm not telling you this for an apology, she replied. I'm telling you because you should understand what our life has been like before you decide you want to be part of it. She told him then, not dramatically, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting history, how she'd moved to a small apartment in a neighborhood his driver would have avoided, how she'd taken commissions for commercial art that paid the bills but felt nothing like the work she'd once dreamed of creating, how she discovered Sumin's developmental differences early and fought for proper assessment, for support, for understanding in a society that often preferred conformity over accommodation. She's brilliant, Ji-yeon said, watching their daughter with fierce pride. She sees patterns everywhere. Numbers make perfect sense to her in a way people sometimes don't. But that makes school difficult sometimes. Minho recognized himself in the description. The same struggles he'd had as a child before channeling his obsessive focus into business problems. And the jewelry design? He asked. A small smile touched Ji-yeon's lips. A lucky break. I was doing commercial illustrations for their catalog when the design director saw some of my personal sketches. It turned out I had a talent for creating pieces people wanted to wear. You always created beautiful things, he said softly. She acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod. It's stable work, good benefits, flexible enough that I can be there when Sumin needs me. The practicality of her choices stood in stark contrast to the artistic dreams she'd once pursued. Another casualty of his ambition. What about the gallery? He asked. Your paintings. Some dreams get deferred, she said simply. Others get replaced by better ones. She looked toward Sumin, who had abandoned the climbing structure and was now carefully arranging fallen leaves in what appeared to be a precise pattern. She's the masterpiece I never expected to create, Ji-yeon said. Everything else is secondary now. Minho felt something shift inside him, a reordering of priorities so fundamental it left him disoriented. Everything he had built, all the wealth he had accumulated, the power he wielded in boardrooms across Asia, none of it seemed to matter compared to the small girl arranging leaves in a pattern only she could see. I want to know her, he said quietly. Not to disrupt your lives, not to make claims, just to know her. Ji-yeon studied him, searching for something in his expression. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, at least partially. Slowly, she said finally. On her terms, not yours. And if at any point it becomes too much or too complicated, we step back. Agreed, he said immediately. I mean it, Minho. This isn't a negotiation where you can change the terms later. Her well-being comes first, always. I understand. Ji-yeon called to Sumin then, waving her over. The girl approached cautiously, glancing between the adults with obvious curiosity. Sumin, Ji-yeon said gently. Minho would like to join us for ice cream. Would that be okay with you? The child considered this seriously, studying Minho with an intensity that reminded him forcefully of board members evaluating a risky proposal. Do you like chocolate? She asked finally. It's my favorite, he answered truthfully. She nodded, decision made. Okay, but I get to choose the shop. It was such a small beginning. Ice cream with a child who didn't know he was her father, supervised by a woman who had every reason to distrust him. Yet as they walked together toward the park exit, Sumin occasionally glancing back to ensure he was following, Minho felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, not completion, but possibility, the sense that the future wasn't fixed by past choices, that new paths could still open if he had the courage to take them. His phone remained off in his pocket. For once, whatever crisis demanded his attention could wait. The real emergency had been his own blindness to what mattered. a condition he'd lived with for so long he'd mistaken it for clarity. The ice cream shop was small, family-owned, with worn booths and handwritten menu boards. Not the kind of place that would appear in business magazines or social media posts. Just a neighborhood fixture where a chocolate cone cost less than the bottled water in Minho's office. Sumin selected a table by the window, arranging napkins with precise movements before sitting down. Minho watched, recognizing the same need for order that had driven him since childhood. "Do you like your job?" she asked suddenly, catching him off guard. "Most days," he answered honestly. She considered this, head tilted slightly. "Yama says work should make you happy at least sometimes, or else it's just work." Minho glanced at Ji-yun, who was paying for their order at the counter. "Your mother is very wise. Are you happy?" Sumin continued, the directness of childhood cutting through pretense. The question landed with unexpected weight. Minho had been called successful, influential, brilliant, but he couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked about his happiness, or the last time he had considered it himself. "I'm working on it," he said finally. Sumin nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable answer. "Me too. Sometimes life gives us a second chance to redefine what truly matters." Has someone ever walked back into your life at exactly the right moment? If the story touched you, please share it with someone who might need this message today.